Okay, so I just want to chat to you a little bit about Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and another surname you may not be familiar with, Anguisola. Now, we'll talk about Da Vinci first. Now, obviously, quite a well-known figure and a great master. Born 1452, died 1519. What's he best known for? Painting the Mona Lisa, I'd say, would be his biggest achievement as thought of in the modern world. People flock to see that, don't they? He's also known for his sculpture, anatomical studies, drawing contraptions for man to fly, military devices, architectural studies, and botanical studies. So this is just a very brief overview of these three artists. So let's take a look at this, the Annunciation, painted in 1472, and it's oil and tempera on panel. Tempera, don't forget, is egg yolk and pigment, and it's a natural emulsion, and that generally goes underneath the oils as an underpainting. And this is quite large, 98 by 217 centimetres, so over 2 metres long. And this is really based on Luke 1, 26 to 39, depicting the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary that she'd conceive miraculously and give birth to a son to be named Jesus, the Son of God, whose reign would never end. And the subject of the Annunciation was very popular for contemporary artworks, painted in Christian countries such as Italy, and has been depicted many times in Florentine art, including several examples by Renaissance painters such as Fra Angelico. And we don't really know much about the commission for this or its early history. It's quite obscure. It's a lovely painting though, isn't it? Great use of perspective and depth. Here we've got the Madonna of the Carnation, painted in 1478, which is an oil on panel. And La Belle Ferronnière, 1490. I think you can always tell a Da Vinci portrait in the colours used for the complexion and the face structure. But this one is really quite interesting. The lady with an ermine, 1489, 54 by 39 centimetres. And at the time of the painting, the medium oil paint was very new to Italy. Previously to this, people used tempera, which, as I've said, is egg yolk and mixed with pigment, which is a natural emulsion. So oil paint was pretty new, and it's quite fascinating really how it gained popularity. But what was brilliant about it is because it took longer to dry. Tempera takes very, very little time to dry, faster than acrylics at times. You can't blend it very often. And so oils are quite new. It was introduced in Italy around about the 1470s. So really you can see that Da Vinci was keen on trying new ideas and new ways. Now the subject of this painting is fairly reasonably certain as Cecilia Geriani, who was the mistress of Leonardo's employer, Ludovico Sforza. And there are quite a few interpretations of the significance of the ermine in her portrait. Now the ermine, which is a stoat in its winter coat, was a traditional symbol of purity because it was believed an ermine would face death rather than soil its white coat. And in his old age, Leonardo compiled a bestiary which he recorded moderation. The ermine out of moderation never eats but once a day, and it would rather let itself be captured by hunters than take refuge in a dirty lair in order not to stain its purity. He repeats this idea in another note. Moderation curbs all the vices. The ermine itself prefers to die rather than soil itself. So could this mean about moderation? So it could mean about Cecilia's purity, or make an association with a lover. Alternatively, though, the ermine could be a pun on her name, because the ancient Greek term for ermine, or other weasel-like species, is galle or galle. So we don't really know, or it could mean both. Now, obviously, quite a familiar picture, The Last Supper, painted in 1495. What makes it so special? Well, this is only really Da Vinci's surviving, although somewhat battered, fresco. and it's one of the most revered paintings in the world, and it's the moment based in Matthew 26:21 when Christ tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. And what's quite interesting is that the mural began to decay during Leonardo's lifetime. Some 50 years after his death, Vasari described it as so badly preserved that one can see only a muddle of dots. It was first restored in 1726, and numerous attempts have been made since then, some sadly doing more harm than good. But why did it decay? Well, the time-honoured tradition for wall painting was fresco secco or fresco bueno. Now, fresco bueno, the true fresco, was well renowned and used a lot by wall painters, and that works by using wet plaster, and you use your wet pigment into the wet plaster. So what happens there is that the plaster on the wall holds the paint. There is fresco secco, which is painted on dry plaster, which is usually used for wooden panels. And that is the problem. Da Vinci decided to use fresco secco, possibly for speed, because he was quite slow, and the monks of the refectory where this is were getting quite impatient with Leonardo and asking him, when are you going to do it? You know, time's ticking kind of thing. So I think he was pressured, so he had to do it quickly. So he used fresco secco, so he painted the paint straight on top of dry plaster. And that was the preferred method here in the UK, and that's why we've got hardly any frescoes at all in our churches, as well as the Reformation obviously got rid of a lot. But with damp walls, there's nothing to secure the paint, to seal it, to hold it, so it just flakes away from the surface of the wall, and that's exactly what happened with this painting. But what's interesting is that Da Vinci also looked heavily into how art changes emotions and how the effects of the atmosphere has on landscapes and how it changes colours. So that's aerial perspective, a term he coined, which you can see in the background, where it's cooler colours at the back, more blues, and warmer colours at the front. So all of his landscapes apply this. We've since seen that science backs this up with blue light and red light, shortwave, long wave light, and all of that kind of thing. He revolutionised the world really with his thoughts and ideas. So yeah, this is based on the bit where it says, while they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me." Being very much aggrieved at this, they said to him, "Lord, it is not I, is it?" So it's all about them questioning and doubting themselves. Now, in one of his preliminary sketches, Da Vinci thought of separating Judas from the figures of the near side of the table. But he rejected this idea as being too crude. So where do you think Judas is? Let's go back. This is a replica version. Painted in Oxfordshire, I believe. Can you tell which one is Judas in amongst all of that discussion? There he is, just part of the crowd. So at this point, Judas had already betrayed Jesus. And there he is, clutching his bag of silver. So why do you think Leonardo made such a point of putting him so close to Jesus? Do you think it kind of makes him feel less obvious? He's not distancing himself, quite brazen and blasé about it. Now, if we look at another version that had been made of this, we can see a bit more detail of the faces and the expressions. So this is what it would have looked like had it been painted in fresco bueno. Just look at those faces, aren't they amazing? Now, Da Vinci often did have a way of creating feminine faces. And sometimes the only thing that makes them look masculine is a beard. So a figure without a beard doesn't necessarily mean it's female. It could be a male. And this is another version, not as well preserved. But look at the emotion, look at the faces, look at the hands, look at the gestures, look at the discussion. And there's Christ in the centre. So there was one painted at the time, just after really. A full-scale version was painted by Giampietrino in 1520. And that's a really good way, because that was painted whilst the original version was still very visible. But here's another version of it there, painted in 1520. Let's just take a look at a few others. The Virgin and Child with St Anne, 1501, quite a large painting there. And there is the young Christ playing with a lamb, as he is the Lamb of God. And of course the Mona Lisa, the most valuable painting in the world, or one of, holds the Guinness World Record for the highest known painting insurance valuation in history at $100 million in 1962. Now what's interesting is the face wasn't just used to convey emotion. From the 15th century, the human face was used to get the whole body proportion. So the face is extremely useful as a measurement and is great as a measuring aid. So all you had to do, not necessarily in a portrait this size, but when we look at Michelangelo's work in a minute, all you had to do is draw the face the size that you wanted, and then you can use that to make the whole proportion for the body. Let's just take a look with this stunning young model here. So the face, so notice I'm saying face, not head, because that's really important. The face is from the hairline to the chin, and you can split that into 3 equal sections. You can try doing that yourself. So you've got your brow to your eyebrows to under your nose, and under your nose to under your chin. So if you think of the term face as a measurement and section, so one of those thirds is going to be called a section. So if I say face, it's the whole face, hairline to chin. Section is just one of those thirds. The face is roughly 5 eye widths wide. The space between your eyes is the width of an eye. The width of your nose is roughly from the corner of the eye straight down, and the width of your mouth is from the centre of the eye straight down. Ears roughly in between your eyebrows and your mouth. So this is how they used that facial section. So you draw your face, and then from the under the chin, so your neck is one section. From the throat, neck to the chest is a face. From the chest to your navel is a face. From the navel to your groin is a face. Now your thigh sits slightly higher than your groin, and that is 2 faces to the knee. From the knee to your ankle is 2 faces plus 1 section, and the foot from the front of the ankle is a face. Now your arm, from your shoulder to elbow is a face plus a section, or from your underarm to your elbow is just a face. From your elbow to your wrist is a face and a section. Excuse me. And your hand is also a face. So imagine that. You don't need to have loads of proportions worked out. So if you're working on a large piece, say a large fresco or something with multiple figures in, you just draw the face the size you want, and then everything else falls into place. How clever is that? So we're round about 3 faces wide and 8 faces tall, with a bit 2 sections. Now back in the Renaissance, this was how they measured men. They said women's measurements were too changeable. Well, actually that's not true, as we later found out with medical technology and understanding that adults, either gender, are exactly the same. But it's harder to use this for children, which is why baby Jesus often looked like a young gnome or a little tiny old man, because they use these proportions to create baby Jesus. And children don't grow like this. Children have very different sections. Their head is quite large compared to their body. So this doesn't work for children, but it does work for all adults. Here's the Virgin on the Rocks, or the Madonna on the Rocks, painted in 1483, and that's oil on wood. And there are 2 paintings of this same name and similar subject, almost identical, by Da Vinci. and there's a few areas of composition that's slightly different. Now, this version in the Louvre is considered to be the prime version, the first version, but both paintings are a similar size. Both are painting in oils in wood on a wooden panel, but the one in the Louvre has actually been transferred to canvas. And both paintings show the Madonna and the child baby Jesus with the infant John the Baptist and an angel in a rocky setting, which is where it gets the name from. The significant compositional differences are the gaze and right hand of the angel, and the colours, the lighting, the flora, the way the sfumato has been used. Now, sfumato is from the Italian sfumare, which means to tone down or evaporate like smoke, so it's to soften. And the date of association commissions are documented. The complete histories of these two paintings are totally unknown, so we don't really know which of the two is earlier, but it is believed that the one here on the left is the earlier of the two. Now, my personal opinion is that I don't think the second one was finished, and I don't believe it is because of the skin tones. To me, that looks too much underpainted, because back then they used to use greens and greys to underpaint the flesh and then glaze Cinabresa, which is quite a bright pink, over the top. And I think that it just doesn't look finished. They look too ghostly compared to any of Da Vinci's other paintings. So I'm not sure that's quite finished, but I could be wrong. We'll have a quick look at Michelangelo now, shall we? Born 1475 to 1564. And I'm just going to check. So slightly younger than Da Vinci. Da Vinci being born in 1452. So there's about 25 years between them. Not exactly, but we'll say 25. So Da Vinci is the senior to Michelangelo. And there was a bit of rivalry between them because they both worked at the same time. Now, Michelangelo's work encompasses painting, sculpture, architecture, and poetry. And obviously, probably more recognised for his stunning creations in the Sistine Chapel, which he wasn't always a fan of because it took him away from doing work that he wanted to do. Now, Michelangelo would call himself more of a sculptor and a poet than anything else. And here we have this beautiful sculpture, a relief sculpture, the Madonna of the Stairs, painted in 1490 by Michelangelo. How beautiful is that? And this is in Florence. So, just to give you some idea, Michelangelo was around 15 when he made this. And we've got the figure of the Madonna sitting on a square stone block in profile while looking away. And that obviously occupies the whole of this relief. Looks very classical. And very dynamic in a way. And she's lifting her dress to feed or protect the child that's asleep. And that creates a bit of a spiral with those. Can you see the stairs slightly on the left-hand side that the other figures are on? And Jesus is let go of his arm and it's just swinging behind him a little bit. So how beautiful is that? Just a fifth. Can you imagine doing that at 15? The Battle of the Centaurs. Now, this was the last work Michelangelo created while under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici, who died shortly after this completion. And again, it's inspired by a classical relief. The mythic battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs, which is a popular subject of art in ancient Greece. It's gorgeous, really. Here we have an angel carved by Michelangelo. He really was perfect. Now, the thing to remember when you see sculptures by any artist back then is that if they're in a museum and not in their original location, they may look odd. The reason for that is when commissioned, the artists would be told where it was going to go, and they would change the proportions according to what they will look like at ground level. Because if you had a normal sculpture and then you decided to put it 25 feet in the air, what would happen is that the feet would look huge and the head would look tiny, because we're on ground level looking upwards. So that would be sort of forced perspective. So if they knew that the figure was going to be 25 foot in the air, what they would do is they would widen the head and shoulders, so from ground level it would look the right proportion. So that's why it's really important when you look at art to ask who commissioned it and why, and where was it originally hung and why, because a lot of artists adapted the painting or sculpture to its location, so the lighting would be different and all of that kind of thing. A pieta. Now, pieta is the term used for whenever you see the Virgin Mary with the dead body of Christ after the crucifixion. And this is the first of the number of works by the same theme by Michelangelo. And this was commissioned for the French Cardinal Jean de Billers, who was the French ambassador in Rome. And it's a Carrara marble, and it was made for the Cardinal's funeral monument, but moved to its current location at the entrance of the Basilica in the 18th century. And it's the only piece that Michelangelo ever signed. But how intricate is that? It's stunning. And there we have a tondo. Now, a tondo is a round painting, and it's just perfectly rounded. And this is an oil and tempera panel, 1507. So it's either called the Doni Tondo or the Doni Madonna. And this is the only finished panel painting by a mature Michelangelo to still survive. And how beautiful is that? The colours are just so vibrant. Now, this is in the Uffizi in Florence, in Italy, still in its original frame. And it was commissioned to by Agnolo Doni to commemorate his marriage, the daughter of to a daughter of a powerful Tuscan family, the Strozzis. And it was created during the period after Doni's marriage in 1503-1504, and before the Sistine Chapel frescoes were begun, because they started in 1508. So here we've got the Holy Family, baby Jesus, well, child Jesus, and Mary and Joseph in the foreground, with John the Baptist in the midground, and 5 nude male figures in the background. There are a few different ways you can think about those nudes, but they certainly give it extra movement and dynamism. Mary's the most prominent figure in this position, taking up much of the centre of the image, sitting directly on the ground without a cushion between herself and the grass to better communicate the theme of the relationship to the earth. Now, Joseph is positioned higher in the image than Mary, although this is an unusual feature in the composition of the Holy Family, because Mary's between his legs as if he's protecting her, and his legs forming a kind of de facto throne in a way for her to sit on. There's some debate as to whether Mary is receiving the child from Joseph or whether she's handing him to Joseph, and it's quite common really to have the 3 of the Holy Family. And John the Baptist really was the patron saint of Florence, so that's also included in Florentine works wherever you depict the Madonna and the Child. Now, he's in the middle ground between the Holy Family and the background, and it's quite a rural family there. And then we'll just have a quick look at the Last Judgment. Now, this is where what I was saying about facial proportions to create the whole body would really come in handy, because this is huge. I don't know if you've ever seen this. This was painted in 1536, and it's 45 foot by 40 foot high. You can see here that these are doorways, standard doors, so it's basically the size of a house, including the roof. and it was commissioned by Pope Paul III to adorn the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo decided to paint it alone without any assistance, and he even refused the aid of physicians after he suffered a heavy fall from the scaffolding. And it was inspired by the Latin hymn Desire by Dante's Inferno. Look at all those figures. Now this is a very interesting piece in many levels, because near the centre of the scene to the bottom right of Christ is St. Bartholomew, and who's sitting on a cloud, and in his hand is a flayed skin. Now I'll see if I can find this so we can see here. There is St. Bartholomew on a cloud, and there is the flayed skin. Now that flayed skin is actually a self-portrait of Michelangelo. There we go. So it's a skin without any body inside it. What an achievement this would have been for Michelangelo. How stunning would it have looked? But when it was unveiled, there was huge controversy raging about the nudity of the figures. That people saw it and they thought it was absolutely obscene and highly unsuitable for religious context. Now, obviously, it's the Last Judgment. So when it was commissioned, it would have been thought of that you are naked in the eyes of God. He sees all. However, contemporaries did not like it. It was scandalous, it was blasphemous, and unsuitably obscene. So do you know what they did? After Michelangelo died, it was decided that they would have loincloths painted over the top to cover the nudity, and they hired a team of artists to go and paint them. And the nickname for those artists were the Breeches Brothers, or the Breacher Brothers, and their job was to paint all of the loincloths and all of the clothing to cover the modesty of Michelangelo's work. So if you've ever looked at it and you thought it felt a little bit odd, that's why. It is not as Michelangelo intended, but that was a real-time change. Almost fairly swiftly after Michelangelo died, it was painted over. Quick look at the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That's it if you're lying on the floor looking up. And the Sistine Chapel ceiling was 4 years in the making. He did have aides to help him with this. He didn't do the Sistine Chapel ceiling alone. One of the famous images, the creation of Adam. There's a lot of discussion about this section, saying how it closely resembles the human brain with the exact shape and everything that we would be familiar with. I don't know whether I agree with that. I don't know if it is or not. Sometimes people can really look too deeply into paintings and it stops you from appreciating it necessarily for what it is. The deluge, a detail of the flood, which is part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and the Libyan Sibyl, which is part of the Sistine Chapel. Look, I mean, everything's painted, isn't it? Just wonderful. So we looked at how he would have sketched out his figures to work out the measurements using the human face. Remember, face and a section. But how did he paint the skin tones? Now, I alluded to this when we were looking at the Madonna on the Rocks by Da Vinci, how I said it looked unfinished. Well, widely known by the 15th century was a technique used by artists known as verdaccio. Now, the translation and meaning of the word verdaccio kind of doesn't make make clear, or it's not really known, but Verda, green, and Accio is fast go, so kind of go green. And in his book El Libro dell'Arte, Cennino d'Andrea Cennino talks about this verdaccio as an underpainting which was for flesh, hair and fabric, a greyish brown in colour, and it was basically made up of leftover colours, so it didn't exist as a colour, it was what the artists had on their palette. And this is the Manchester Madonna by Michelangelo, and unfinished. It's in Manchester. It doesn't show the Virgin Mary in Manchester. That's just where it is, and it's unfinished. But here you can see how his process for painting. And he seems to have painted from left to right, but actually started and finished the right hand side. So the right hand side is totally finished, the centre is semi-finished, and the left hand side is verdaccio. So how they would do is they would paint in verdaccio, and then they'd probably use burnt sienna, which was advised at the time to draw out the details of the face, and then they would use a dark green for shading on the under the chin, around the nostrils, the corners of the eyes, and so on. And when that was all dry, they would use a colour known as cinnabrasa, which is kind of burnt sienna and red oxide and white, and they'd thin it and lighten it and glaze over it. And what happens is that the flesh tone colour glazing over the greeny greys neutralises it, and it looks more solid. And then once they'd done that, they would dilute it and whiten it a little more for more highlights, and then whiten it and glaze more for other highlights. So you build up very gradually the highlights. So it's quite fascinating that we knew that from Cennini's book, which was written in the 1500s, and it's basically the first ever art instruction manual. It's absolutely amazing read. But seeing it in the flesh, so to speak. So if they were painting a corpse, they would use less flesh tone and reveal more of the underpainting of the verdaccio. Lastly, I just want to talk to you about Sofonisba Anguisola, which you may have never heard of. Female artist, and slightly younger again, born 1556. No, born 1532. This is a self-portrait in 1556. And born in northern Italy, in Cremona. And, of a fairly wealthy background, and she was given a well-rounded education, which included the fine arts. And her father actively encouraged her and 6 siblings to develop their talents. And at the age of 14, she went on to study under the well-respected portrait artist Bernardino Campi. And this is her self-portrait. Now, what's really interesting is that although women were allowed and encouraged to create and go into fine arts, there were restrictions. So women weren't allowed to attend life drawing classes because they weren't allowed to see nude men. And there were also some, not totally, restrictions about women painting in churches and all of that kind of thing. Some did, and it varied from location to location, but largely it wasn't the thing of the time. But that did mean that the female artists of the day, of which there were many contemporaries, and it makes me so cross that we don't find out about them in all of the art history books that I grew up with, although there was mainly one, the E.H. Gombrich History of Art. Hardly any women painters existed in that book, and that was pre-Google. So I grew up thinking that there weren't many female artists, which was a shame. And Gombrich's book coloured everybody's views for decades. But because female artists couldn't do certain things, it meant that they could really hone their skills in portraiture. And one of my most favourite paintings by Sophonisba Anguisola is this, the chess game. Just look at that little girl's grin. And it's not even a huge painting for 4 portraits. So, as a young woman, Anguisola travelled to Rome, where she was introduced to Michelangelo, who immediately recognised her talent. Meeting Michelangelo was a great honour for her, because he was one of the first celebrity painters, if you like. He was well known. And she actually had the benefit of being informally trained by him. And he made a request for her to do a drawing of a weeping boy. And she did. She drew Boy Bitten by a Crayfish and sent it back to Michelangelo, recognising her talent. He gave her advice and sketches from his notebooks to draw in her own style, and then it's almost like a correspondence school, and she'd do that and he would give her critiques and help her on her way. How amazing is that? So that happened for at least 2 years with this informal study and guidance from Michelangelo, and this was the drawing that her brother bitten by a crayfish, which she later turned into a painting. So female artists of that time were often either doing biblical scenes or portraits, family portraits. And here's her family portrait. Painted in 1557. And portrait of her mother, the same year. How stunning are they? She's often overlooked, basically because of her gender. Women artists have been written out of art history for a very long time, and we kind of only hear about the more modern ones. We forget how many there were. And they weren't just hobby painters, they were employed portrait painters, some even court painters for kings and queens. So they had huge jobs in their day, and histories overpainted them and attributed their paintings to male contemporaries in many cases, which is very sad. And it's only now, with more technology, that we're able to give these female painters the correct attribution and hang their work where they have always should have belonged. Elizabeth of Valois. And this one is absolutely amazing, because you could think this was the 1920s rather than the 1570s. This was attributed to El Greco, but it's later been believed that it was Anguisola. Now, she enjoyed quite a lot of encouragement and support than most of the average woman of her day. Her social class, as we said, couldn't let her study art the way a male contemporary could, but it did mean that she could really work on portraiture. She also travelled to Milan, where she painted the Duke of Alba and the Queen of Philip II of Spain. She was a keen amateur painter, and Anguisola was recruited to go to Madrid as her tutor with the rank of Lady in Waiting. How fascinating is that? She became an official court painter to King Philip II of Spain, and adapted her style to the more formal requirements of official portraits for the Spanish court. And she stayed there for 14 years and taught and guided the Queen's artistic ability. So an extremely significant painter of the Renaissance. And I'm betting out of these 3 names, you hadn't really heard of her. And this is her portrait of the Queen of Spain. After the Queen died, Philip helped arrange an aristocratic marriage for Anguisola. She moved to Palmero and then Pisa and Genoa, where she continued to practice as a leading portraitor with the support of her 2 husbands, living to the age of 93. She did mainly self-portraits and family members, but in her later life she did do religious themes, but most of her religious paintings have either been lost or misattributed. So I hope you found that really interesting. I've mentioned Anguisola a little bit more because she needs to have that recognition alongside her contemporaries. She was a wealthy patron of the arts, and then her eyesight diminished, and she died in 1625. But her work lasted. The influence of what she had accrued over the years of her work, it was a great influence for generations of artists, and the success of Anguisola led the way for more women to pursue serious careers as artists. Vasari, the art historian, wrote that she's shown greater application and better grace than any other woman of our age, and in her endeavours at drawing she has thus succeeded not only in drawing, colouring and painting from nature and copying excellently from others, but by herself has created rare and very beautiful paintings. And this is her self-portrait in 1610. 15 years before she died, so this is her in her 80s. So 3 fantastic Renaissance artists side by side in this little talk where they belong. And I never mentioned the rivalry between Da Vinci, obviously, and Michelangelo. Da Vinci hated Michelangelo's figures. We said, didn't we, that Da Vinci's figures were quite effeminate. Even his male figures were quite effeminate. But Da Vinci hated Michelangelo's figures. He said they were far too muscular, and he likened them to a bag of walnuts. And when you look here, I suppose that the way the muscles are all showing, even the women are a bag of walnuts with boobs stuck on. So I can kind of see Leonardo's point. It just shows that everybody's got a very different style. Even back in the Renaissance, they were all taught the same way, but they all had their own style of working. So I hope you found that interesting, looking at these 3 artists, and we'll do some more again. Thank you very much.